The Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy was the most costly of all American wars in terms of loss of human life, and also the most destructive war ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. The deaths of 75,000 people, a true national tragedy, constituted only part of the impact of the war on American society. Most important, the Civil War freed 4 million people from slavery, giving the nation what President Lincoln called the new birth of freedom. The war also transformed American society by accelerating industrialization and modernization of the North and destroying much of the South. These changes were so fundamental and profound that some historians refer to the Civil War as the Second American Revolution. While this chapter summarizes the majority of military aspects of the Civil War, it, like the AP exam, emphasizes the social, economic, and political changes that took place during the war. The war begins. When Lincoln took office as the first Republican president in March 1861, people wondered if he would challenge the succession of South Carolina and other states militarily. In his inaugural address, Lincoln assured Southerners that he would not interfere with slavery. At the same time, he warned no state had the right to break up the Union. He concluded by appealing for restraint. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. Fort Sumter. Despite the president's message of both consolation and warning, the danger of war breaking out was acute. Most critical was the status of two federal forts in states that had succeeded. One of these, Fort Sumter, in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, was cut off from vital supplies and reinforcements by Southern control of harbor. Rather than either giving up Fort Sumter or attempting to defend it, Lincoln announced that he was sending provisions of food to the small federal garrison. He thus gave South Carolina the choice of either permitting the fort to hold out or opening fire with its shore batteries. Carolina's guns thundered their reply on thus April 12, 1861, the war began. The attack on Fort Sumter and the capture, after 2 days of incessant pounding, united most Northerners behind a patriotic, fight to save the Union. Use of executive power. More than any previous president, Lincoln acted in unprecedented ways, drawing upon his powers as both chief executive and commander-in-chief, often without the authorization or approval of Congress. For example, right after Fort Sumter crisis, he called for 75,000 spending for war and 75,000 volunteers to put down for the insurrection of the Confederacy, authorized spending for a war, and suspended the privileges of writ and habeas corpus. Since Congress was not in session, the president acted completely on his own authority. Lincoln later explained that he had to take strong measures without congressional approval as indefensible to the public safety. Secession of the Upper South. Before the attack on Fort Sumter, only 7 states of the Deep South had seceded. After it became clear that Lincoln would use his troops in the crisis, 4 states of the Upper South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, also seceded and joined the Confederacy. The Confederates then moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia. The people of Western Virginia remained loyal to the Union, and the region became a separate state in 1863, keeping the border states in the Union. 4 other slaveholding states that might have seceded but instead remained in the Union, the decisions of Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky not to join the Confederacy was partly due to the Union sentiment in those states and partly the result of shrewd federal policies. In Maryland, pro-secessionists attacked Union troops and threatened the railroad to Washington. The Union Army resorted to martial law to keep the state under federal control. In Missouri, the presence of the U.S. troops prevented the pro-South elements in the state from getting control, although the guerrilla forces sympathetic to the Confederacy were active throughout the war. In Kentucky, the state legislature voted to remain neutral in the conflict. Lincoln intentionally respected its neutrality and waited for the South to violate it before moving in federal troops. Keeping the border states in the Union was primary was a primary military and political goal for Lincoln. Their loss would have increased the Confederate population by more than 50% and would have severely weakened the North's strategic position for conducting the war. Partly to avoid alienating Unionists in the border states, Lincoln rejected initial calls for emancipation of slaves. Wartime advantages. The Union and the Confederacy each started the war with some strengths and some weaknesses. Military. The Confederacy entered the war with the advantage of having to fight only a defensive war to win, while the Union had to conquer an area as large as Western Europe. The Confederates had to move troops and supplies shorter distances than the Union. It had a long, indented coastline that was difficult to blockade, and experienced military leaders and high troop morale. The Union hoped its population of 22 million against the Confederates' population of only 5.5 million free whites would work to its favor in war attrition. The North's population advantage was enhanced during the war by 800,000 immigrants. Emancipation also brought 1,800 African Americans to the Union Army in critical final years of the war. The Union could also count on the loyal U.S. Navy, which ultimately gave it command of the rivers and territorial waters. Economic. The Union dominated the nation's economy, controlling most of the banking and capital of the country. More than 85% of the factories, more than 70% of railroads, and even 65% of farmland. The skills of the North clerks and bookkeepers proved valuable to the logistical support of large military operations. Confederates hoped that European demand for its cotton would bring recognition and financial aid. Like other rebel movements in history, Confederates counted on outside help to be successful. Political. Two sides had distinct goals. The Confederates were struggling for independence while the Union was fighting to preserve the Union. However, the ideology of states' rights proved a serious liability for the new Confederate government. The irony was that in order to win the war, the Confederates needed a strong central government with strong public support. The Confederates had neither, while the Union had a well-established central government, and Abraham Lincoln and the Republican and Democratic parties had experienced politicians with a strong popular base. The ultimate hope of the Confederates was that the people of the Union would turn against Lincoln and the Republicans and quit the war because it was too costly. The Confederate States of America. The Confederate Constitution was modeled after the U.S. Constitution, except that it provided a single 6-year term for the president and gave the president an item veto, the power to veto only part of a bill. Its Constitution denied the Confederate Congress the powers to levy a protective tariff and to appropriate funds for internal improvements, but it did prohibit the foreign slave trade. President Jefferson Davis tried to increase his executive powers during the war, but Southern governors resisted attempts at centralization, some holding back troops and resources to protect their own states. At one point, Vice President Alexander H. Stephens, in defense of states' rights, even urged the secession of Georgia in response to the despotic actions of the Confederate government. The Confederacy was chronologically short of money. It tried loans, income taxes, including a 10% tax in kind on farm produce, and even impressment of private property. But these revenues paid only for a small part of the war cost. The government issued more than $1 billion in paper money, so much that it caused severe inflation. By the end of the war, the value of a Confederate dollar was less than 2 cents. The Confederate Congress nationalized the railroads and encouraged industrial development. The Confederacy sustained nearly 1 million troops at its peak, but a war of attrition doomed its efforts. We will read on in part 2.